Trapped, injured, and hunted, her only hope of survival stood on 4 hooves. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe for more intense survival stories. We upload daily. She could feel every part of her body trembling, a raw combination of cold and fear mingling inside her bloodstream. Emma Carter lay on her side, snow grinding into the wounds on her leg, the taste of blood hot on her lips. The howling wind whipped against her ears with a high-pitched shriek, threatening to drown out the rapid beat of her heart. She tried to remember how she'd ended up here, broken down, half-frozen, one leg twisted at a sickening angle, but the immediacy of the moment swallowed her thoughts. Instead, her attention fell upon the massive shape standing resolutely. In front of her, head high against the biting wind, it was a Mustang, its dark coat flecked with icy crystals, mane and tail lashing violently in the gale. She didn't know why he stayed when escape lay in every direction, but he refused to leave her side. It wasn't logical. It wasn't even remotely natural for a wild horse to linger with an injured human, especially now, when an even deadlier threat than the storm lurked somewhere behind the swirling curtains of snow. But there he stood, a silent sentinel in the heart of the blizzard. Her breath came out in ragged bursts, each exhalation stinging her lungs. If she couldn't get up, she would freeze to death out here. The storm had struck without mercy, a savage force that seemed determined to bury the entire mountainside under an ocean of white. Emma tried to move her injured leg, but a pain so sharp and primal ripped through her that she cried out. The sound, torn from her throat as if it were an animal's cry. Her mind spun. She thought of the small cabin she'd seen earlier, only 100 yards away when she and the Mustang, she called him Ghost for the way he seemed to appear out of nowhere, had first stumbled across it. 100 yards might as well be 100. Miles with her leg in this condition, and the howling storm blasting every inch of her exposed skin. She could feel numbness creeping from her toes upward. She couldn't let the cold seep into her heart. A murmur of voices drifted to her on the icy wind, barely audible, yet distinct enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through her system. The men were still out there. She didn't know who they were, or why they'd chased her, but she remembered seeing them earlier in the day, armed, rough-looking types who seemed bent on driving her deeper into the wilderness. Maybe they were poachers, or maybe they wanted something else from her. She'd seen the glint of rifles in their hands, the arrogance in their laughter, and she knew they meant her harm. She had tried to outrun them on Ghost, but the terrain had proved treacherous. When her horse slipped, she was thrown violently. Now she was paying the price with a broken leg and a battered body. The voices swirled in her head, and the reality that these dangerous men might close in on her any second became more pressing than even the storm. Forcing the pain down, she clutched at Ghost's mane, pulling herself up as best she could, every muscle screaming in protest. The Mustang pawed at the ground, anxious, possibly sensing the impending confrontation. If Emma could just reach the cabin, maybe she could barricade herself inside, at least find shelter from the deathly grip of the cold, and hide from the men hunting her. But how could she walk that far with a broken leg, especially through deep snowdrifts? She felt Ghost shift closer. The horse lowered his head, almost as though inviting her to lean on him. She had no better option, so she pressed her weight against his powerful shoulder, gritting her teeth at the agony that radiated through her entire side. The horse let out a warm snort, the steam visible in the frigid air, and took a cautious step forward. Emma clung to him, half limping, half dragged, her mind a swirl of pain and grim determination. Each step felt like a conquest over death, a refusal to surrender. Every foot gained toward the cabin was a minor miracle, and the wind howled with unrelenting fury around them, whipping her hair into her face. The numbness in her fingers threatened to make her lose her grip entirely. Behind them, the men's voices became clearer, and Emma's heart thundered louder. Would they see her tracks in the snow? Yes, they would. There was no hiding footprints in fresh snowfall. She could only hope that maybe the wind, which had proven such a formidable enemy, might cover the tracks quickly. Ghost halted for a moment, ears swiveling in the direction of the distant sounds. Emma felt him tense, muscles quivering beneath his coat. Any second now, she expected another gunshot to crack through the roar of the wind. She imagined a bullet burying itself in Ghost or in her back, but none came. Perhaps the men were biding their time, or maybe they had lost sight of her. She couldn't be sure. All she knew was that she had to keep moving. Her mind flickered back to the day's events. She had been traveling across the high country, searching for a missing horse, an old friend's beloved mare, when she spotted Ghost. He was standing at the edge of a stand of pines, as though waiting for her. It was unusual enough to see a wild Mustang alone, but this one seemed curious, almost beckoning. Then, everything changed in the blink of an eye. A shot rang out in the distance, and Ghost bolted. Emma, spooked and confused, tried to follow him, only to stumble upon these men who were clearly out for blood. She still didn't know what they wanted. Were they illegal poachers? Thieves? She had glimpsed the tags on the ground, some equipment that looked more high-tech than what a typical hunter would carry. Then she remembered running, remembered Ghost appearing again, as if guiding her away from them. He'd allowed her to ride him, a decision that might have saved her life. Now, here they were, on the edge of survival, with a storm that threatened to kill them both, and men who would finish the job if the storm didn't. She let out a strangled cry as Ghost trudged through a deep drift that reached almost to his belly. The shift in snow caused her to slip, and she nearly fell face first into the whiteness. Red-hot pain shot from her ankle up to her thigh. She pressed her face against his neck, inhaling the earthy scent that grounded her in this moment of extreme danger. One step at a time, they pushed forward. It felt like an eternity before the dark outline of the cabin came into view, partially obscured by gusts of swirling snow. It was a small, dilapidated structure, a minor hunting cabin or trapper's shelter from seasons long past, by the look of its sagging roof and missing window shutters. But to Emma, it appeared more inviting than a five-star resort, if she could make it inside. If the place still had four walls and a roof that wouldn't collapse, she'd have a fighting chance to regroup. Ghost paused at the threshold. The door had either been torn off its hinges by the force of the wind, or was missing for some other reason. Inside, the gloom swallowed all detail, save for the swirling flakes that found their way in. Emma swallowed, hard, mustering the last vestiges of her energy. She urged Ghost inward, the horse stepping gingerly onto the warped floorboards. The interior offered partial relief from the blistering wind, though it was still bitingly cold. She could hear the timbers creak ominously, as though complaining about the intrusion. But no matter how unwelcoming the cabin felt, it was infinitely better than being fully exposed to the storm outside. She slid off Ghost's side, collapsing onto what might once have been a bench near the entrance. Every nerve felt alight with pain, and she gasped, tears slipping down her cheeks. Ghost stood beside her, ears flicking, eyes wide. She whispered a shaky thanks, although it felt inadequate to express the sheer gratitude that coursed through her. The horse had saved her life twice over, once by allowing her to escape the men, and again by carrying her through the storm. Now, though, she needed to address her injuries. She needed fire, water, and any form of medical supplies if she was going to avoid infection or succumbing to the elements. Hobbling around, she pressed her weight against the wall. The cabin was more or less one large room, with a small offshoot that might be a closet or storage area. Broken chairs and a rickety table lay scattered about. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, a godsend if it still worked. Emma shuffled toward it, ignoring the throbbing in her leg. She reached down to test her thigh and hissed in pain when her fingers found a makeshift splint she'd tried to tie earlier. She knew the break was bad. She could sense bone fragments shifting. She needed proper medical attention, but that was impossible unless she managed to get back to civilization. For now, she'd have to rely on her wits. A cursory glance told her the fireplace might be functional, but the hearth was clogged with debris. She cursed quietly, wishing she had more time or more strength. She rummaged around the edges of the cabin, searching for anything flammable. Wood, old cloth, anything. The darkness made her efforts difficult, and her vision kept swimming from the pain. She was half aware of Ghost standing near the entrance, occasionally pawing at the floor. He seemed to sense danger everywhere, ears constantly swiveling, muscles quivering, as though he expected those men to burst in at any moment. Emma's heart hammered in her chest. She felt it too. The cold was a relentless enemy, seeping into her bones and threatening to extinguish her consciousness. She couldn't let that happen. She needed to stay awake, to stay sharp. She found a few pieces of splintered wood by what used to be a table leg and some scraps of half-rotted cloth. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to start a small fire. She hobbled back to the fireplace, biting down on her lip until she tasted blood. She crouched, the agony in her leg making her head spin. She tried to remember if she had any matches or a lighter in her pockets. She patted herself down and, in a stroke of luck, found a small steel lighter she had picked up from her jacket pocket before setting out that morning. Her gloved hands trembled as she flicked it, producing a tiny spark that flared into a small, precious flame. She guided it to the kindling, praying the dampness wouldn't snuff it out. A curl of smoke wafted up, and then, bliss, a flicker of fire took hold. She fed it carefully, blowing on it as gently as her shivering would allow. Ghost watched from across the room, his breath rising in puffs. The faint light illuminated the horse's silhouette, the reflection dancing in his eyes. For a moment, in that small flicker of light and warmth, Emma felt a surge of hope. She managed to feed the flames until a modest fire crackled in the hearth. The heat it provided was minimal compared to the vicious cold pressing in from the shattered windows, but it was something. She leaned back against the wall, feeling exhaustion drape over her like a heavy blanket. She realized she was drifting in and out of awareness, her mind torn between the immediate relief of the meager warmth and the terror that the men might arrive at any second. A sharp gust of wind rattled the walls, sending a fresh gust of snow swirling through the open doorway. She jerked awake, heart pounding, unsure how much time had passed. The fire still glowed weakly, and Ghost was still there, standing guard. It was almost as if the Mustang understood she needed his presence, his companionship to remain tethered to reality. Another wave of pain in her leg reminded her that she couldn't rest for long. She needed to secure the entrance if possible, needed to make sure no one could sneak up on them. But as soon as she pushed herself upright, the cabin door frame darkened. She froze, instinct screaming. Someone was outside. She could just barely make out movement beyond the doorway, a shape in the swirling snow. Her blood ran cold, a fresh spike of adrenaline shooting through her veins. Ghost tensed, ears flattening. Emma scanned the floor for a weapon. Anything. She spotted a piece of broken chair leg, something she could maybe swing if she had enough strength. Her breath sounded deafening in her own ears as she reached for it. Then, to her horror, a voice rose over the wind. "I see you in there. You're making this difficult for yourself." Her stomach dropped. It was one of them. The men had found her. She tightened her grip on the makeshift club, though she hardly had the energy to stand, let alone fight. Ghost let out a low snort, scraping, his hoof against the floor. The figure outside stepped closer, the faint flicker of the cabin's firelight catching on what looked like a rifle. Emma's thoughts scrambled. Could she reason with him, bribe him? She didn't know what they wanted. All she knew was that they'd shot at her, chased her, and if they cornered her now, things wouldn't end well. She forced her voice out, raspy from the cold. "Leave me alone," she called. "I have nothing you want." The figure let out a cold laugh. "We'll see about that. Come out, and this will be easier for you." She braced herself. Easier meant a bullet in the head or something equally grim. She wasn't going anywhere. She felt the heat of the fire on her side, a small reminder that she was still alive, still capable of defiance. She tried to think of a plan, some way to outsmart them. The cabin was small, and if more men arrived, she'd be trapped. Maybe she could distract them, slip away in the storm. But the storm had diminished somewhat, which meant her footprints would be that much more visible. As if reading her mind, the wind howled again, a flurry of snow blasting across the threshold. The figure outside cocked his rifle, the metallic sound a chilling promise. Emma's pulse drummed in her ears. She steeled herself, ready to swing, the chair leg if he tried to enter. But before she could tense further, Ghost lunged forward, erupting into action like a thunderbolt. The Mustang's body crashed into the intruder with a force that rattled the rotting cabin walls. The man howled, stumbling back into the snow. Emma heard the crack of a rifle shot, felt the whistle of something passing by her ear. She instinctively dropped to the floor, clutching her makeshift weapon. Ghost reared up, wild eyes and flailing, hooves, letting out a piercing whinny that reverberated through the night. The intruder yelled curses, trying to swing the butt of his rifle at the horse, but Ghost was too quick, stepping aside with the fluid grace only a Mustang possessed. Emma seized the moment. She crawled forward, ignoring the agony in her leg. She emerged onto the porch area, the firelight casting a faint glow behind her. The swirling snow made it difficult to see, but she heard another man shouting from somewhere. To the side, she glimpsed movement, more shadowy figures converging. Ghost backed up, positioning himself protectively in front of Emma, steam rolling from his nostrils. Two more men appeared, their outlines flickering in the storm's low visibility. One of them fired a shot that ricocheted off the wooden wall. Splinters flew, and Emma shielded her face. She needed to move, needed to get away, but her body was failing her. The man Ghost had knocked down rolled to his side, raising his rifle again. Emma's heart seized. She had to do something. She raised the broken chair leg, an absurd weapon against firearms, but it was all she had. As the barrel of the rifle swung in her direction, an unearthly roar came from above. Ghost lunged again, tackling the man before he could pull the trigger. The weapon discharged into the sky. The flash lit the swirling snow in a momentary burst of whiteness and shadow, illuminating Ghost's wild expression. The man crumpled as the Mustang's powerful hooves crashed into his chest with a force that seemed impossible. Another shot rang out from behind Emma. She heard it before she felt the sting at her shoulder, a burning line of pain that tore across her jacket sleeve. She cried out, dropping the chair leg. Her vision blurred momentarily. She twisted around, half crawling, half dragging herself back inside the cabin. The second man, the one who had taken the shot, advanced with grim determination. Ghost let out a furious neigh, but the man was out of the horse's immediate reach. Emma's hands fumbled around in the darkness, searching desperately for something, anything, that could give her an edge. Her numb fingers touched cold metal, the revolver. She'd forgotten all about the small revolver she had found in the drawer earlier. She seized it, pulling back the hammer with shaking hands. She turned just as the man stepped into the cabin, his rifle aimed straight at her head. Without time to think, she squeezed the trigger. The revolver kicked in her grip, the roar deafening in the tight space. The man stumbled, a look of shock on his face as he staggered sideways. He fell to his knees, cursing in pain. Emma's chest heaved, adrenaline surging. She didn't have time to confirm whether he was fatally wounded. Another figure loomed in the doorway, but a flash of silver and a cacophony of hoofbeats told her Ghost had charged once more. She heard the dull thud of impact, the gasping yelp of the attacker. All around her, the cabin seemed to be collapsing into chaos. Gunshots, curses, whinnies, and the relentless roar of the wind fighting to be heard over it all. She realized she might die here. She was bleeding, her leg was broken, and the men didn't seem to tire. But in the midst of that terror, Ghost refused to leave. He stood over her, challenged her attackers, never once abandoning her to the storm or to the violence. Emma pulled herself deeper inside, leaning against the wall, trying to regain control of her breathing. She lifted the revolver again, forcing herself to focus on the doorway. If anyone else entered, she would shoot first. She had no choice. The other men might have fled, or they might be regrouping. The storm was still fierce, but not enough to hide them forever. She felt blood trickling down her shoulder, soaking her sleeve. She was dizzy, her thoughts sluggish. She had to fight, to stay alert, to keep her eyes from sliding shut. For a moment, the world went quiet except for the howl of the wind and the crackle of the meager fire. She heard hoofbeats outside, the sound of Ghost pacing. Every fiber in her body wanted to lay her head down and surrender to exhaustion, but she knew that would be the end of her. She forced her eyes to remain open. Her mind raced over possible escapes. The storm might still offer enough cover to slip away if the men retreated, but where could she go? She couldn't ride effectively with her leg in this condition, and she couldn't walk more than a few steps. Even if she tried, the blood loss and hypothermia might finish her off before morning. Then she heard a rumble in the distance that made her chest tighten. Avalanche. It was faint, but it was there. A deep, resonant sound like thunder rolling through the mountains. The heavy snowfall had likely overloaded the slopes above them. If a real avalanche tore down the mountainside, it wouldn't discriminate between Emma, the men, or the horse. It would swallow them all in an icy tomb. She needed to get lower ground or more secure shelter, but this rickety cabin was hardly safe. Another wave of pain crashed through her leg, sapping what little resolve she had left. She almost laughed at the insanity of it all, fleeing armed men in the midst of a lethal storm, her only ally a wild Mustang whose motivations she couldn't fully understand. She heard a muffled shout outside, followed by more gunshots. Ghost neighed furiously, but it sounded a bit farther away. Emma's fear spiked. Were they drawing him away? She tried to scramble up, but she could barely place weight on her leg. She bit back a scream. She reached the doorway, peering out into the swirling snow. She caught a glimpse of Ghost's silhouette, bounding through the drifts, kicking up clouds of white as he charged at a cluster of figures near a thicket of pines. She counted 3 men. One brandished a shotgun, the muzzle flashing as he fired blindly at the rampaging horse. Somehow, Ghost avoided the worst of it, pivoting with the agility of a mountain cat. Emma couldn't stand by. If Ghost went down, she'd be utterly alone and defenseless. Gritting her teeth, she braced herself against the doorframe and fired, the revolver into the air, hoping to distract the men. The shot rang out, echoing across the snowy field. 2 of the men whipped around, returning fire in her direction. Bullets tore into the wood around her, splinters stinging her face. She ducked back into the shadows, heart hammering. It was enough distraction, though. Ghost seized the moment and charged again, crashing into one man and sending him sprawling, face first, into the snow. Emma felt a flicker of triumph, but her vision blurred again as waves of dizziness struck. Her shoulder wound throbbed, and the cold had drained her of nearly all energy. She worried about her revolver's ammo. She'd found it in a half-broken drawer. Who knew how many rounds it held, or if they were even reliable? Already, she'd shot multiple times. She didn't dare waste any more bullets unless she was sure of her target. The swirling chaos outside continued, muffled by the wind. Ghost's neighs mixed with shouts of anger and pain from the men. Emma clutched the revolver in numb fingers, her entire frame shaking. She thought about how she'd gotten here, the original search for that missing mare, the strange fortune of running into Ghost, and the unyielding chain of events that had led to this life-or-death struggle. She had never expected to fight off armed attackers in a deserted wilderness with a broken leg, aided by a wild Mustang. Life had a brutal way of unraveling. Then suddenly, the night was ripped by a deeper roar. This time the avalanche was unmistakable, a monstrous grinding sound that made the ground tremble beneath her. Emma felt a wave of dread. She knew that when an avalanche broke loose, it could race downhill with terrifying speed, snapping trees like matchsticks, burying entire cabins under feet of snow and ice. She forced her gaze upward toward the dark slopes beyond the pines. Through the haze, she saw a shifting wall of white, a ghostly behemoth barreling down the mountain. The men must have seen it too, because the gunfire ceased, replaced by frantic shouting. Ghost came tearing out of the pines, aiming toward the cabin in a mad gallop. Emma's jaw went slack. Could he outrun it? And what about her? She couldn't even run at all. Before she could react, a figure burst into the cabin, the battered doorframe scraping against his shoulder. It was one of the men, bleeding from a gash across his brow, face contorted in panic. He raised his rifle, eyes wide with fear. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. "The avalanche!" Emma, battered though she was, instinctively lifted her revolver. She didn't trust him, but he didn't seem to be aiming at her now. He looked more terrified of the unstoppable wave of snow than of the woman he'd been hunting. Another thunderous rumble made the walls quake. She could feel the vibrations in her bones. She thought of diving behind some furniture, but it would be pointless. If the avalanche hit full force, the cabin's meager walls wouldn't stop it. The man let out a ragged curse and bolted outside again, apparently deciding that outrunning the avalanche was a better option than waiting to be crushed. Emma braced herself, blinking back tears of shock and pain. She had to move, but how? She heard Ghost neigh just outside, as if calling to her. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she gripped the doorframe and pulled herself upright. Another monstrous roar echoed, louder this time. She peered out and saw the wave of snow barreling closer, devouring trees and boulders. It was as if the entire mountain was collapsing. She sucked in a breath, ignoring the pain, and locked eyes with Ghost, who stood a few yards away, stomping and tossing his head. The horse looked ready to bolt, but he hesitated, watching her with an intensity that made her heart clench. She could barely stand, let alone run, but if she stayed, she would die. crushed by the white tide. Ghost! She yelled, her voice cracking. The Mustang pivoted, trotting to her. She flung her free arm around his neck, pressing her forehead to his mane in a desperate plea for help. He snorted, muscles tense beneath his coat. Without pause, the horse lowered himself slightly, allowing Emma just enough leverage to half tumble onto his back. She gasped as the motion jarred her broken leg. Another wave of excruciating pain nearly knocked her unconscious, but she clung to him, nails digging into his dark mane. Ghost sprang away from the cabin, hooves thundering against the ground. She could sense his fear, his instinct to outrun the collapsing mountain behind them. Emma held on, vision swimming, as the avalanche roared nearer. The cabin vanished into a blur of white as snow crashed down, tearing the structure apart with horrifying ease. The air was filled with swirling debris, chunks of ice, and a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. Ghost ran, plunging, into the darkness of the snowstorm, hooves churning through drifts that threatened to swallow them whole. Emma felt the avalanche's cold breath on her back, an unstoppable force rolling closer, spewing clouds of powder that stung her eyes and made breathing nearly impossible. She didn't know which direction they were going, or if they even had a prayer of outrunning it. All she could do was trust Ghost. The Mustang navigated the terrain with supernatural grace, zigzagging between looming pines and leaping over fallen branches. She thought of the men, of their rifle, of how they might now be buried under millions of pounds of snow. It was a terrible thought, but her focus remained on survival. The thunderous sound of the avalanche persisted, sometimes seeming to abate, only to surge again. Ghost pressed on, climbing a small rise that led to a thicker cluster of pines. Trees could act as a partial barrier against the slide, if only they reached them in time. Emma's head pounded from the combined pain, fear, and exhaustion. Her body slumped forward against Ghost's neck, and she blinked hard to remain conscious. The swirling snow made it impossible to see more than a few yards ahead, but Ghost somehow found a path. His steps were purposeful, yet frantic, driven by an ancient survival instinct. The ground trembled beneath them again, and Emma felt a surge of snow rush by, close enough that she caught glimpses of logs and branches tumbling along in the maelstrom. Ghost sidestepped a cascade of powder, nearly losing his footing on a patch of ice. Emma cried out as her broken leg slammed against his flank, fresh pain exploding. She briefly lost her grip, arms flailing. She nearly slid off, but Ghost jerked to the side, allowing her to regain her hold at the last second. They cleared. The cluster of pines, the slopes shifting downward into a narrow ravine. Snow still drifted heavily, but it seemed less chaotic here. The avalanche had swept around the higher ridges, and the worst of it might have bypassed this shallow channel. Emma swallowed hard, trying to gauge if they were truly safe. The roar dulled, now more like distant thunder rolling behind them. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw a massive plume of white snow and debris receding toward the lower valley. Her heart hammered with relief and terror. They had made it out of the direct path, but the storm itself was far from over. Above them, dark clouds continued to dump fresh snow. Ghost picked his way forward, step by step, until they were out of immediate danger. Emma felt her body shaking uncontrollably from both cold and shock. She realized she might be in the early stages of hypothermia. She needed warmth, needed to tend to her wounds. But where could they go now? The cabin was gone, destroyed by nature's fury. The men who chased her were scattered, possibly dead. Even if some survived, they were in no condition to continue the hunt at this moment. She sagged forward, pressing her cheek against Ghost's neck. The Mustang's warmth was the only real comfort she had left. As the minutes stretched on, she realized Ghost was still moving, carrying her deeper into the ravine. Perhaps he sensed a safer area, or recognized a path. Emma didn't know. She only hoped it led somewhere with cover. With her eyes half-lidded, she felt time blur. She might have passed out for seconds or minutes. When she blinked awake, she was still on Ghost's back, but they had stopped near a small overhang of rock. It wasn't a real cave, but it jutted out enough to shield them from the worst of the wind and snow. Exhaustion settled over her like a heavy weight. She needed rest, even if it was just for a moment. Ghost lowered himself, allowing Emma to slide off. She landed on the cold ground with a thud and a choked cry of pain. She forced herself to breathe. The avalanche's roar was gone now, replaced by the keening wind. She glanced around the small space. It was cramped, but it offered better protection than standing out in the open. Ghost stood guard at the entrance, tail swishing. Emma lay back, her leg a throbbing mass of agony, her shoulder bleeding. She needed to stop the bleeding. She fumbled with her jacket, pulling out a knife she kept in a hidden pocket. Her movements were clumsy, and she winced with every motion. She used the knife to cut strips of fabric from her shirt, pressing them to her shoulder wound. It stung, like fire, but the bleeding seemed to slow. She tied the makeshift bandage, grimacing at the searing pain. Next, she had to check her broken leg. She peeled back the tattered remains of her pants around her thigh, nearly passing out at the sight. The leg was swollen, discolored, and bent in a way it definitely shouldn't be. She needed a real splint. She found a sturdy branch near the overhang and began tying it along the outside of her leg with more shredded fabric. Tears streamed down her face despite her attempts to hold them back. But she forced herself to continue. If she didn't at least stabilize the bone, the damage might become irreparable. Ghost edged closer, exhaling a soft nicker as though to comfort her. She patted his neck weakly, grateful for his presence. What a strange turn of fate that a wild Mustang she'd only encountered hours earlier would become her lifeline. She rested her head against the cold rock, trying to find some measure of calm. Thoughts of rescue seemed distant and unrealistic. No one knew where she was, and the avalanche had likely blocked or destroyed any nearby roads or trails. She was on her own. Well, not entirely alone. She still had Ghost, but would he stay with her indefinitely? A wild horse had his own instincts, his own needs for survival. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she fought the pull of sleep. She knew if she fell unconscious in this cold, she might not wake up again. The ache in her bones was insistent, like an alarm bell telling her to stay alert. She tried to focus on the small details, the color of Ghost's coat, the pattern of swirling snow outside, anything to keep her mind engaged. She wondered about the men who had chased her. Did they survive the avalanche? Were they trapped somewhere, nearby? Or had they been swept away by the unstoppable wave of snow? She felt a pang of guilt at the thought of anyone dying like that, even those who had shown her nothing but hostility. But survival was brutal and impartial, just like the avalanche itself. Time blurred again. She couldn't say how long she lay there, listening to Ghost shift his weight, occasionally stepping outside to paw at the snow. At one point, she heard a distant rumble, another small slide perhaps, but not as catastrophic as the first. Eventually, she forced herself upright, ignoring the pain that flared from her shoulder and leg. She needed water, needed to melt some snow or find a stream. Dehydration would only worsen her condition. She reached her hand outside, scooping a small handful of fresh powder, bringing it to her lips. It was an act of desperation, offering a brief relief to her parched throat. Although eating snow outright could drain precious body heat, she had no stove, no real fire here under the rock overhang. The best she could do was let small amounts of snow melt in her mouth and hope she wouldn't freeze faster as a result. She eyed the revolver still in her belt. She couldn't remember how many shots remained. She had used it multiple times, and there might be 1 or 2 bullets left at most. What would she do if the men reappeared, or if another threat presented itself? She pushed the thought away. One crisis at a time. Her current priority was staying alive long enough to see daylight. Maybe if the storm let up, she could try to navigate to a known trail. That was wishful thinking with a broken leg. But maybe Ghost could carry her again. He had already shown an uncanny willingness to help. The hours dragged on, the storm's fury lessening incrementally. though the cold never relented. Emma slipped in and out of a hazy doze. Each time she jolted awake, fear spiked through her as she remembered where she was and how dire the situation remained. She prayed for dawn, for some sign that nature's wrath was subsiding. At one point, Ghost whinnied softly, drawing her attention to the east. The horizon, obscured by jagged peaks, had taken on the faintest tinge of grey. Morning was coming. A wave of relief swept over her, though it was tempered by pain and the reality that she was still stranded. But morning meant light, and with light might come a chance to better assess her surroundings. As the sky brightened to a dull pewter, Emma got her first real look at the devastation around them. The avalanche had carved a path of destruction that was visible even from here. Mounds of snow and uprooted trees formed a jagged scar across the mountainside. The entire landscape looked raw and battered, as if it had been ravaged by some monstrous entity. She shivered, grateful she and Ghost had escaped its wrath. In the distance, she spotted movement, a few deer emerging from a cluster of fir trees. They seemed cautious, as though uncertain if the worst had truly passed. She envied their natural resilience to the cold. She considered her next move. If she stayed under this rock overhang, she might avoid the brunt of the wind, but she'd slowly starve or freeze without better shelter or supplies. The cabin had been her only refuge, and it was now gone. There might be other cabins or outposts in these mountains, but she knew the terrain was vast and unforgiving. The men had forced her to ride blindly through it, and she was uncertain of her current location. She looked at Ghost, who regarded her with an alert, intelligent gaze. Could he lead her somewhere else, somewhere safer? It was a gamble. Then again, everything about her predicament was a gamble. Doing nothing was as good as giving up. She tried to stand, wincing as the makeshift splint bit into her swollen flesh. The pain was excruciating, but she used the rock wall for support and managed to rise on one foot. She coaxed Ghost closer, stroking his muzzle. The horse's breath warmed her fingers. The very presence of this creature filled her with a strange, unspoken reassurance. She hoped that Bond would hold, that he wouldn't simply leave her behind. She tossed what was left of her coat over his back, hoping it might make mounting him slightly easier without causing him discomfort. He snorted but stood still. With a grunt that turned into a broken cry, she hauled herself up, draping her uninjured leg over his flank. Once more, she let out a small whimper as her broken leg dangled. She wrapped her arms around Ghost's neck, burying her face in his mane, taking a moment to steady herself and suppress the tears that welled in her eyes. She urged Ghost forward with a soft click of her tongue, unsure if he would respond. But he did. He moved with caution, as though sensing her vulnerability, picking his way through the rocky ground beneath the overhang. They emerged back into the open. She could see the sky more clearly now, a turbulent blend of grey clouds and occasional cracks of pale sunlight. The wind still blew, but not with the murderous intensity of the previous night. Ghost set a slow, careful pace, heading downslope. Emma had no idea if this direction led to safety or even to a less snowbound area. She only knew they couldn't stay put. As they made their way through the ravine, the destruction left by the avalanche became more apparent. Piles of snow with snapped pines jutting out, some broken clean in half, others uprooted entirely. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine and disturbed earth. Several times, Ghost stopped short, ears flicking, and Emma's stomach twisted, thinking it might be the men. But each time, it turned out to be shifting snow or the distant creak of stressed tree limbs. She exhaled each time, relief mingling with dread at the unknown. Gradually, as they ventured lower in elevation, the snowpack thinned. The difference wasn't drastic, but enough that Emma noticed pockets of darker earth and rock peeking through. Her spirits lifted slightly. If they continued downward, maybe they'd reach a forest road or a stream that could guide them to more inhabited areas. She glanced at the sky, trying to gauge how much daylight they had. The sun was still hidden behind layers of cloud, but she guessed it was mid-morning. Each hour that passed was an hour closer to nightfall, another test of survival in these frigid mountains. Her thoughts turned to basic needs, food and water. Her meager attempts at melting snow with body heat wouldn't sustain her for long. She needed to find a stream, or at least gather enough firewood to make a proper fire and melt snow in some kind of container. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, the revolver with questionable ammo, and a knife. A spark of bitterness welled up. She was usually well prepared for mountain travel, but the day's events had spiraled beyond anything she could have anticipated. The confrontation with those men had forced her to flee with nothing but the clothes on her body and a wild horse. And now, battered and broken, she was praying for a miracle. Ghost halted unexpectedly, nostrils flaring. Emma braced herself, scanning the landscape. They had come to a narrow clearing flanked by thick pines and a rocky slope. The wind had carved drifts into strange shapes. But among those shapes, she spotted movement. Her heart lurched. 3 figures stood about 50 yards away, partially hidden by the dense conifers. Instinct told her to duck, but it was too late. They'd seen her. She tensed, waiting for them to raise rifles. She thought of the revolver at her side, but doubted her ability to shoot accurately from Ghost's back, especially with her injuries. A pang of dread coiled in her stomach. Who else would be out here besides those men? As the figures edged closer, she realized something crucial. They weren't dressed like the men who had chased her. These individuals wore winter gear in more subdued colors, their posture uncertain rather than aggressive. One of them raised a hand, signaling in a cautious, non-threatening manner. Could they be rescue workers? She thought that was too optimistic. Maybe they were hikers or locals checking avalanche damage. Emma's mind raced, weighing options. Ghost sensed her agitation, shifting beneath her. She considered turning and fleeing, but she doubted she could outrun them if they meant harm, not with her injuries. So she remained still, swallowing her fear. One of the strangers called out, voice echoing in the cold air. "Hey, are you okay?" Emma didn't respond immediately. She felt tears pricking at her eyes, a jumble of relief and trepidation. She didn't know them, but they clearly saw she was wounded, saw the horse. Another step closer, and Emma noticed they carried no rifles. One had a walking stick, another a backpack, with what looked like first aid gear attached. Could this be her lifeline? The man in the lead took a few more steps, then halted, noticing Ghost pawing the ground defensively. "We're not here to hurt you," he said. "We saw the avalanche path. We're searching for survivors." Emma's throat constricted. Survivors. That meant the avalanche had likely prompted a rescue effort. She almost laughed in raw relief, but also felt suspicion gnaw at her. The group wore bright jackets, carried gear. Maybe they were an organized search team. She glanced at Ghost, uncertain if he'd let them approach. But the Mustang stood still, ears half tilted back, watchful yet not attacking. Emma called out, her voice weak. I'm hurt. My leg is broken. My shoulder's been grazed by a bullet." She hadn't meant to mention the bullet wound so bluntly, but she was beyond pretense at this point. The lead man's eyes widened. He gestured to his companions, who immediately began digging into their packs for medical supplies. They approached slowly. Ghost tensed, but remained in place. Emma tried to slide off his back, but her muscles wouldn't cooperate. Sensing this, the 2 men and 1 woman carefully reached out, supporting her weight and gently lowering her to the ground. She stifled a scream as agony flared anew in her leg. They laid her on a thermal blanket they'd spread out, and the woman, who introduced herself as Paige, quickly assessed Emma's injuries. She had a calm demeanor, her voice reassuring. "We're volunteers with a local search and rescue," she explained, checking Emma's pulse and shining a small flashlight in her eyes. The other 2, Mark and David, examined the makeshift splint, and began preparing a sturdier one. Emma's mind reeled. She'd gone from utter isolation and imminent death to suddenly being surrounded by helpful strangers. Tears of gratitude welled up, though she still felt the weight of the ordeal pressing on her. She glanced around for Ghost, spotting him a short distance away, watching warily. She tried to speak through the haze of pain. "Ghost saved me. He wouldn't leave me." Her words came out slurred with exhaustion. Paige followed her gaze, eyes lighting up at the sight of the wild Mustang. "He's gorgeous," she said softly. "He must be special to stick with you like that." Emma nodded weakly, swallowing a sob. She had no way to explain just how much she owed that horse. David and Mark wrapped her leg with more professional bandages, offering what seemed like an actual medical splint. The process hurt more than she thought possible, but she grit her teeth, knowing it was necessary. Paige cleaned the shoulder, wound as best she could with antiseptic from her kit, murmuring apologies each time Emma flinched. They gave her a water bottle and some energy gel, small comforts that felt monumental. Emma felt her strength returning, though the pain was still overwhelming. She noticed Mark eyeing Ghost, clearly intrigued. "You said you were shot at?" he asked. Emma nodded, explaining in halting words about the armed men who chased her, how they might have been poachers or criminals of some kind, and how the Avalanche might have taken them out. The search and rescue team exchanged concerned glances. "We'll radio this in," Paige said. "For now, we need to focus on getting you out of here." Emma glanced again at Ghost, fear twisting her gut. Would he vanish if she was taken away by these strangers? She found the thought horrifying, an inexplicable sense of loss. Paige must have seen the look on her face. "We'll figure out how to keep him close," she assured. "Let's get you stable first." Emma's grip tightened on Paige's sleeve. "He saved my life so many times." "Don't leave him." Paige nodded resolutely, and the men started setting up a makeshift sled that they could pull through the snow, an improvised rescue stretcher. They coaxed Ghost forward with gentle motions, and Emma was relieved to see. He didn't run. He eyed them suspiciously, but eventually allowed them to approach. Minutes later, they had Emma strapped into the rescue sled, bundled in blankets, and ready to be towed. David motioned to Mark, and together they began pulling the sled along a path that cut through the ravine. Paige walked beside Ghost, holding a rope lightly looped around his neck, not tight, just enough to guide him. The Mustang followed, stomping occasionally, clearly uneasy but not resisting. The journey was slow, every bump sending fresh jolts of pain through Emma's broken body. But it was still 1,000 times better than the helpless predicament she'd faced alone. They trudged onward, occasionally stopping so the men could rest and reorient themselves. Paige kept an eye on Emma's vital signs, offering sips of water and making sure the splints stayed in place. Ghost remained a silent guardian, never straying far. When they crossed a partially frozen stream, he snorted and danced, but Paige managed to calm him with a soothing tone. Emma marveled at how quickly Ghost seemed to adapt to the presence of these rescuers. Perhaps the horse sensed they meant no harm. Eventually, after what felt like hours of slow progress, the trees began to thin, and Emma saw a small clearing ahead with a snow-covered path, a Forest Service road perhaps. Parked near the edge were 2 snowmobiles and a larger tracked vehicle, presumably part of the rescue team's equipment. Relief and an odd twinge of disappointment flooded her. She was saved, but the primal closeness she'd forged with Ghost, in the heart of danger, might now be severed by the practicalities of the modern world. Still, she couldn't deny the overwhelming gratitude she felt for the rescue team. They were her lifeline. Mark radioed for further assistance, requesting a vehicle that could transport Emma to the nearest hospital. Paige addressed her gently, explaining the plan to load her onto a more stable sled behind a snowmobile. Emma gritted her teeth, trying not to whimper as they moved her. She glanced at Ghost. The horse stood near the tree line, ears perked, watching intently. She dreaded the moment they'd have to leave him behind. She could hardly imagine explaining to the authorities that this wild Mustang wasn't really wild to her anymore, that he was a companion who had risked everything to protect her. But she had no choice. She needed medical help, and she needed it fast. To her astonishment, Ghost moved closer, following the group until he was just a few yards away from the snowmobile. He stomped, pawing at the ground, seemingly agitated by all the noise and machinery. Paige clicked her tongue softly, trying to calm him. Emma whispered hoarsely, "Please, can he come with us?" She felt a bit foolish, knowing this was a complicated request. Paige exchanged glances with her teammates. "We can't put a horse on a snowmobile," Mark said apologetically, "but maybe he'll follow on foot if we go slow enough." Emma nodded, tears stinging her eyes. She reached out a trembling hand. Ghost stepped forward, nostrils flaring, and lowered his head. She stroked his muzzle, wishing she could do more to reassure him. With Emma secured, the rescue team started up the snowmobiles. The engines roared and Ghost balked, taking several quick steps away, ears flattening. Emma's heart sank. She feared he'd bolt, unable to handle the noise. But after a moment of prancing nervously, Ghost stopped. He looked at Emma, then cautiously followed as the machines moved forward. The pace was slow, designed not to jar Emma too severely and to keep from spooking the horse completely. Sure enough, Ghost trotted behind, though he kept a wary distance from the roaring engines. The process was nerve-wracking. Every time the snowmobile revved or the sled jostled, Emma flinched, both from pain and from fear that Ghost would run off or injure himself. Yet he persisted, trailing after them as if bound by an unseen tether. Emma felt an overwhelming mix of relief and emotion she couldn't name. That horse had fought off armed attackers, guided her through a deadly storm, survived an avalanche, and now was following her into a world where he didn't belong. She whispered to herself that once she recovered, she'd find a way to care for him, no matter what it took. She owed him her life many times over. After a grueling trek, they arrived at a more substantial clearing where a helicopter waited. Emma's breath caught. It made sense. Airlift was often the fastest way to get severely injured patients out of remote mountainous regions. But a helicopter would mean leaving Ghost for shore. She wanted to protest, to beg them to wait for a horse trailer or some other solution, but her shoulder burned and her leg was on fire and she could feel her consciousness slipping. Paige and Mark hurriedly approached the helicopter crew, explaining Emma's injuries. The rotors thundered, whipping up snow in blinding gusts. Ghost, standing near the tree line, whinnied and reared, thoroughly spooked by the noise. Emma's chest constricted at the sight of him. She forced herself to focus, trying to push the pain away for one last moment. She beckoned weakly, tears streaming. "Ghost!" she rasped, wanting to convey gratitude, longing, an apology for leaving him. The horse paced anxiously. The helicopter medics guided the sled forward, loading Emma carefully. Her vision blurred, tears mixing with the swirling snow. In her final glimpse before the helicopter doors slid shut, she saw Ghost standing alone, ears pinned back, mane tossing, in the rotor wash, refusing to move until the helicopter lifted off and soared away. Then the swirling snow overtook her vision, and the last thing she felt was an overwhelming sadness at their parting. She blacked out. When Emma next opened her eyes, she was in a hospital bed, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Her throat felt scratchy, and every part of her body ached, but the immediate stab of pain in her leg had been dulled by medication. The beep of a monitor kept time with her heartbeat. She blinked, disoriented, her thoughts slow and sluggish. Gradually, she recalled the rescue, the helicopter, the reason she was here. A wave of relief and sorrow crashed through her. She was alive, but Ghost was gone. Questions tumbled over one another in her mind. How long had she been out? Had the men from the wilderness been found? And where was Ghost? A nurse entered, smiling gently at her. Emma tried to speak, but her voice failed. The nurse offered a cup of water, helping her drink. After a few sips, Emma managed to rasp a question about the horse. The nurse looked puzzled, then offered to get the attending physician. Minutes later, a tired-looking doctor arrived, gave Emma a quick exam, and explained what had happened. She'd been in surgery for her leg, pins and plates inserted to stabilize the fracture. She'd lost a fair amount of blood, but the bullet, graze, was not life-threatening, just painful. The men who attacked her were being searched for by local authorities. And the horse? The doctor didn't know. Emma's spirits plummeted. She had 1,000 questions, but her body was weak. She mustered the strength to ask if the rescue team had said anything about the Mustang who followed them. The doctor seemed uncertain, said she'd have to check the notes. Emma's eyes filled with tears she couldn't stop. She owed her life to that animal, and now there was no telling if he'd wandered back into the wild, or been captured, or worse, shot by the men. The nurse placed a comforting hand on her shoulder and told her to rest. Over the next several days, Emma's story spread around the hospital. Staff came by, curious to hear firsthand about her harrowing ordeal, how a wild Mustang had saved her multiple times. Some were skeptical, others enthralled. Emma repeated the tale in a weary, pained voice, always ending with how she'd lost him at the helicopter. In quiet moments, she agonized over whether he was safe, cursing her helplessness. Then, on the third day, something unexpected happened. One of the search and rescue volunteers, Paige, stopped by, out of breath and grinning from ear to ear. She told Emma to get into a wheelchair if she could manage, that there was a surprise waiting. Outside, Emma's heart fluttered. With the nurse's help, she settled into the wheelchair, leg cast and all, wincing but determined. Paige guided her through the corridors, out into the crisp winter air by the ambulance bay. And there, standing under the pale morning light, was Ghost. He was thinner, covered in dried mud and snow, but very much alive. Emma gasped, tears streaming. She reached out a trembling hand, and Paige wheeled her closer. Ghost stomped anxiously, but when he saw Emma, he let out a low nicker, stepping forward to sniff her hand. Emma let out a broken laugh that turned into a sob. She buried her face in Ghost's mane, inhaling the scent of wild freedom and renewed hope. Paige explained that a local rancher had found Ghost wandering near a back road a day after Emma's airlift. Recognizing the description from the rescue bulletin, he contacted the team. They had managed to corral him gently and bring him here, knowing how important he was to Emma's story, and to Emma herself. As the wind swept across the hospital parking lot, Emma's heart felt full in a way she'd never experienced before. Relief flooded her system, mingling with awe at the horse's unwavering loyalty. She didn't understand the deeper reasons for Ghost's devotion, but she knew it was real. For a moment, all the terror, pain, and uncertainty of the past days faded. She stroked his neck, the soft whirls of hair reminding her of how many times she'd clung to him in desperation. She whispered thanks, over and over, voice catching, in her throat. Later, when she was back in her hospital room, local authorities arrived. They asked her questions about the men who chased her, about what she saw in the wilderness. She told them everything she could recall, from the moment they fired shots to the Avalanche and the final confrontation in the cabin. They took her statement, promising to follow up. Emma didn't have high hopes they'd ever catch the men, if they weren't already claimed by the Avalanche. She was just grateful to be alive. During their conversation, several doctors and nurses poked their heads in, wanting a glimpse of the miracle horse outside. Word had spread quickly, and Ghost had become something of a local legend. Finally, when the interview was done, Emma was left alone for a few minutes. She stared at her cast, at the IV in her arm, at her bandaged shoulder. She felt the weight of everything that happened, yet somehow she didn't feel fear or despair. She felt strong, resolute. She had survived, More than that, she'd discovered an unbreakable bond with a creature whose spirit refused to be tamed by circumstance or intimidation. She thought about how close she'd come to giving up in that cabin, how she'd felt death press in on her from every side, men with guns, the avalanche, the storm. Ghost had stood by her, time and again. When she was discharged several weeks later, Emma had a plan. She arranged for Ghost to come with her to a small ranch on the outskirts of town. The local rancher who found him volunteered to help her care for him while she healed. It wasn't easy. Ghost was still wild at heart, restless in the confines of paddocks and stables, but he never showed aggression toward Emma, never lashed out. On the contrary, he would stand near her, ears forward, as though keeping watch. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, she'd sit by the fence, leg propped up on a cushion, just talking to him. She'd recount the horrors they faced and the small miracles that allowed them to survive. He'd flick his tail, shift his weight, and occasionally whinny softly, as if understanding every word. Days turned into weeks, and as Emma's leg mended, she often reflected on the chain of events that brought them together. She'd gone looking for a missing mare and ended up hunted by ruthless men, nearly killed by nature's wrath, rescued by a search team, and ultimately reunited with a wild Mustang who chose not to leave her side. It was the kind of story people might not believe if they hadn't witnessed pieces of it themselves. But Emma knew the truth. She felt it in the ache of her healing bones, in the softness of Ghost's muzzle when he nuzzled her hand. A month after her release from the hospital, Emma found herself standing, albeit on crutches, in the paddock with Ghost. She had practiced walking short distances, building her strength. The day was bright but cold, winter still clinging to the air. She gently set aside her crutches, leaning against the fence for support. Ghost approached, inquisitive, his dark eyes studying her. She felt her heart flutter. Could she ride him again? The thought thrilled and terrified her. She knew he wasn't truly broken or domesticated, but their bond was undeniable. She patted his flank, murmuring soft words of encouragement. The rancher who had helped them stood nearby, cautious but supportive. Emma took a breath, letting the crisp air fill her lungs, then eased herself onto Ghost's back with as much care as possible. The horse stood still, muscles twitching, but not running. Emma exhaled, the sensation of being astride him bringing back floods of memory, gunshots, blizzards, avalanche thunder, and yet a potent sense of safety she only felt with this horse. She motioned for the rancher to step away. Ghost began to walk, hooves crunching softly in the snow-dusted dirt. Each sway sent a tingle of both pain and exhilaration through Emma's wounded body. It was the first step in a new chapter she'd never anticipated. She was no longer just riding a horse. She was trusting a partner who had stood by her in life's darkest moments. When the short ride ended, Emma slid off, leaning on her crutches again. Her breathing was ragged from the effort, but her spirit felt light. She looked into Ghost's eyes, and he nudged her gently, as if to say, "We did it." She smiled, despite the tears that formed in her eyes. No one else would fully grasp the depth of their connection, forged in adversity and sealed by unwavering loyalty. She patted his neck again, whispering, "Thank you." That night, Emma posted a message on social media, sharing a glimpse of her story for friends and family who had worried during her disappearance. She talked about the wild Mustang who saved her life, about surviving a storm, an avalanche, and a brush with violent men. Messages of awe and disbelief poured in, but she wasn't seeking attention. She wanted to honor Ghost's unwavering courage. Over time, news outlets picked up the story, albeit with sensational headlines. They called it a miraculous rescue, focusing on the drama and the improbable bond between a wild horse and a stranded woman. Emma gave a few interviews, always highlighting how it was Ghost's choice to stand by her. She didn't want to cheapen the experience or turn it into a spectacle, but she did want people to understand that courage can come from unexpected places, and that sometimes we survive the impossible only because we refuse to abandon one another. The local authorities kept her informed about their search for the men. Most were presumed dead, buried in the avalanche, though one or two might still be unaccounted for. Either way, Emma tried not to let that fear control her. She focused on healing, on forging a path forward with Ghost. The rancher who had taken them in encouraged her to stay as long as she needed, insisting that Ghost belonged there as much as Emma did. And so they stayed, day by day, reclaiming normalcy. Yet in quiet moments, Emma would remember the storm's roar and the cabin's flickering fire, recall the panic in her soul when she thought Ghost might run. She remembered how he had refused to leave, how his presence alone sometimes kept her from giving in to despair. That memory became a wellspring of strength. She might have scars on her body and nightmares that woke her at night, but she also had an unbreakable bond with a creature whose spirit remained wild and free, no matter what man-made corral tried to contain him. One crisp afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the pines around the ranch, Emma stood by the fence, now able to walk with just a slight limp. She gazed at Ghost grazing in the pasture. She was lost in thought, replaying the terrifying nights in the cabin, the gunfire, the avalanche. A surge of gratitude washed over her. It felt too big for words, overwhelming her chest with emotion. She realized in that moment that survival wasn't just about escaping death. It was about forging a new understanding of life, about carrying forward the lessons learned under mortal threat. That's what she had now, a depth of empathy, a humility, and a quiet ferocity to live each day fully. She called Ghost's name, and he lifted his head, ears tilting in her direction. She laughed softly when he broke into a gentle canter, coming toward her with powerful strides. He slowed to a walk near the fence, pushing his muzzle over the top rail to greet her. She ran her fingers through his mane, feeling the softness against her palm, remembering how she had clutched that mane in desperation on so many occasions, relying on him to outrun death. She murmured, "I won't leave you either." In that promise, she felt a sense of closure. They were a team now, beyond the confines of danger, forging a bond that neither storms nor bullets could break. This entire journey, from the moment she set off to find a missing mare to this quiet moment of reunion, had changed Emma in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She had discovered reserves of courage she never suspected, had witnessed the unwavering loyalty of a wild animal, and survived nature's most ferocious tests. She'd also seen the worst of humanity in the men who tried to hunt her down. Yet, in the end, Ghost's steadfast presence outweighed her memories of human cruelty. Goodness and bravery, even when found in an unexpected ally, shone brighter than any darkness. If this story impacted you, let us know where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of survival and the incredible bonds that defy all odds. Life can change in the blink of an eye, and sometimes our best chance at making it through is the most unlikely companion imaginable. We upload stories like this every day, so don't forget to like, share, and hit that subscribe button. Thank you for joining us on this harrowing journey. Total word count, 8,095.